What is the latest on the ground? How is Kremlin facing off with the Western sanctions?
Yeah, we've had this video address from President Putin to mark a public holiday here in Russia, and he talked about the possibility of diplomatic solutions. So now for Western leaders in London and Washington and around Europe who are watching those comments by Vladimir Putin, that perhaps gives them a slight sense that there is a door opening now to some sort of diplomatic talks in the coming days. However, there was also a lot of tough rhetoric in that speech by Vladimir Putin. He talked about building up Russia's navy and their army and the rest of the military, and also talked about buying the most advanced weapons for the Russian military. So a bit of a sort of combination there, talking about diplomatic solutions, but also saying that he wants to build up Russia's military, and also talking about how Russia's interests are non-negotiable. So that speech from Vladimir Putin, perhaps a slight little bit of the door opening to some sort of meeting, but we'll have to see how that plays out in the coming days. At the moment, we are still a very long way away from any sort of a summit or talks between the US and their allies and Russia.
Giles, you've been in Russia for quite a while, and you know this better than I do, that Vladimir Putin, as contentious as he is as a political figure, the portrait of him is very different from that in Russia and those in the West. He's largely hailed as a national hero, defending Russia's national interests. For example, in his hours-long address, he talked about the fact that, fact that Ukraine is part of Russia culturally, historically, and in terms of the spiritual space of the Russian people. How was Vladimir Putin's address received within Russia?
Well, it depends what you look at. If you watch state-controlled propaganda television here in Russia, they've just been playing that address that he made on Monday evening local time here in Moscow, just on a loop. These images of Vladimir Putin making that speech at this large wooden desk with these Russian flags flanking him, and then signing some documents in this opulent hall within the Kremlin. If you look at the Russian parliament, well, they have unanimously voted, lawmakers in the Russian parliament, to approve President Putin and giving him the ability to send troops into these two breakaway regions of Ukraine, the self-proclaimed republics of Luhansk and Donetsk. But if you talk to Russians out on the streets, yeah, there are a lot who are very nervous about criticizing Vladimir Putin in this highly authoritarian society, but they are also happy to talk about the fact that they are concerned, that they are nervous or even openly against any sort of a conflict breaking out between Ukraine and Russia.
Giles, we're very concerned about what will happen next. We've heard about reports of bombardment of Ukraine's state-controlled electric stations over there, power stations. Do we know if Russia will make more assertive moves into Ukraine, sending more troops, for example?
Well, I think the next step that we really need to be watching is if there is clear evidence, if the Russians are making it clear that they are putting Russian boots on the ground in those two self-proclaimed republics of Donetsk and Luhansk, because that would really be seen as a very big escalation by Western powers. So far, we've had reports from the Reuters news agency, for example, over the course of the last day or so, seeing unmarked tanks, armoured vehicles going into the city of Donetsk in one of those two breakaway regions in eastern Ukraine. But we haven't yet had Russian state media putting out images of, lines of tanks or troops in those parts of eastern Ukraine. So that is going to be clearly a bit of a flashpoint. And Western allies have also warned Putin that if he goes a step further in that, if he launches some sort of a full-scale military invasion of Ukraine, heading for Kiev perhaps, then that is going to trigger much, much more serious sanctions than the ones that they've announced so far.
Well, Giles, can you help us fact-check some information here? Because it has been a war of narratives, a war of information before we see actual troops sending in from one country to another. For example, Maria Zakharova, Russia's foreign ministry spokesperson, called out Western media outlets such as Bloomberg, New York Times, and the Sun media, saying they're fake news, basically, trumping up, the war narratives, and she would like to plan her vacation accordingly. But at the end of the day, Russia does, recognize the independence of those two Russia-affiliated republics, right? So, what are myths and what are facts?
Well, what we're hearing from the Kremlin side is this message that we heard a lot of in Putin's speech, which is, he was talking about historically how, in his view, communist Russia, the USSR, had effectively founded Ukraine, had created Ukraine. And the message from his speech, that hour-long address that he gave on Monday night local time here in Russia, was effectively that Ukraine doesn't even have the right to exist as a country. Of course, that is something that is not a view shared whatsoever by Western allies, by NATO, who have been very clear about things like Vladimir Putin demanding that there is some sort of assurance that the Ukrainians aren't able to join NATO in the coming years. NATO, Western allies have been very clear. They've been saying this is a decision for Ukraine, a sovereign country.
Well, Giles, before we let you go, one last question. We know that Russia has somehow gained influence over those two republics, Donetsk and Luhansk, ever since 2014, since a referendum happening over there. Why does Putin decide to, officially recognize their independence, which means, their de jure independence now? Why now?
There could be, this is purely speculation, but there could be a calculation going on here within the Kremlin that this was a step that they could take without incredibly serious sanctions being placed on the Russian economy, that they could recognize the independence of these two self-proclaimed republics, that they could perhaps even move troops, Russian troops, into those areas in the coming days. And yes, there would be sanctions against the Russian economy, as we've seen from the US and Germany and the UK, but that those sanctions wouldn't quite be at that top level that we've been hearing about, the mother of all sanctions, that we've had warnings about those over the last few weeks, haven't we? So perhaps that is Vladimir Putin's calculation, that he can take this step, but if he goes a step further, invading Ukraine in a full-scale invasion, then the sanctions that would come down from that, from the US, from the UK, etc., would just be so crippling for the Russian economy that it wouldn't be worth doing. As ever, we are always trying to read the tea leaves with Vladimir Putin, trying to figure out what his thinking is. I think if anybody tells you that they do know what he's thinking, that they do know his strategy, then clearly they're lying, because Vladimir Putin has a very close circle of just a few advisors. Some of them may know, but the rest of us really are just waiting and watching to see what he does next.